Victor Raines had run the Pinecrest office for 17 years, and Frederick Lorne had been waiting in chair 14 with a coffee going cold for 45 minutes, and when Victor came through the lobby and told him to leave, Frederick left without a word. The security guard walked him to the glass door and held it open and let it close behind him. What Victor didn't know was that the man in the worn parka and the scuffed work boots had been sworn in as Inspector General of Service Canada 15 days earlier and had driven 3 hours up the 400 to Pinecrest for the specific purpose of investigating him. Then 2 dark government vehicles turned into the parking lot from Ridgemont Road. The car was a 2012 Civic hatchback in the color the dealership had once called sterling gray, and that 17 Ontario winters had turned into something more honest than that. Frederick had driven it up from Ottawa the evening before and slept at a motel off the highway that charged $89 a night and had a vending machine that dispensed coffee in a styrofoam cup the size of a thimble. He was 53 years old and had been a widower for 6 years, long enough that the word no longer came with a catch in the chest, but had settled into him the way certain facts do, the way a man's height settles, or the town he grew up in. It made him quiet, not unhappy quiet, just quiet in the way of a person who has learned that most conversations are not improved by his participation. He had been appointed Inspector General 14 weeks into the new government, and nobody in Ottawa had been entirely sure what to do with him. Because he had spent the previous 11 years as a senior complaints analyst, which is a position that makes a man very good at reading between the lines of documents that nobody wants him to read. His deputy had drafted a briefing note recommending the Pinecrest matter be referred to the Regional Compliance Office in Barrie. Frederick had read it, thanked her, and booked a motel room off the 400. The condition his deputy insisted on, a check-in call every hour on the hour, and a 2-person support detail waiting at a service plaza 32 kilometers south, close enough to reach him if anything happened, far enough that no federal plates would sit visible through the window of the Pinecrest Service Canada office. Frederick agreed to the detail, the way a man agrees to something he considers a formality. He made the first call from the parking lot at 8:49. It lasted 11 seconds. He gave his location, said the road north of Barrie had been fine, and ended it. The office opened at 9. He walked in at 9:02 and took number 47 from the dispenser near the door. The waiting area had 16 plastic chairs in 4 rows and a wall of service windows across the back, 6 of them, 3 open. The carpet was the gray-green of most government buildings, chosen to be impossible to stain visibly, and it was doing its job. Near the door, a rack of pamphlets, EI applications, old age security, Canada pension plan, how to update your SIN record, how to apply for veterans benefits. Frederick took the EI pamphlet and read it twice before they called number 38. He kept a yellow legal pad on his knee and a pen with the cap chewed on one side. He wrote nothing on it. He was watching the service windows. Window 2 was being worked by a young man, maybe 24, with the focused expression of someone who has been given a checklist and takes checklists seriously. He called each number clearly, asked each person what they needed, typed quickly. He worked at a pace that would have cleared the room by noon. His nameplate read A. Fisk. Window 4 moved at half that speed. The woman there was efficient enough but kept leaving her terminal for reasons that were never quite clear, and twice she came back with a supervisor rather than answering a question herself. Window 3 was currently closed. Frederick put the EI pamphlet back on the rack. At 9:31, the door behind the service windows opened, and Victor Raines came through it. He was the sort of man who fills a room by announcing it. 60 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the stride of someone accustomed to doors opening before he reaches them. He wore a checked dress shirt without a tie, sleeves rolled to the forearm, which was either casual confidence or a calculated gesture at being approachable, and Frederick suspected it was both at once. He moved along the back of the office greeting service staff by first name, and the regular clients who recognized him with a handshake or a nod. Twice he bent slightly to hear something said at window level and then laughed. It was a good laugh. You would like him if you met him here. That was the core of the problem. The file on Pinecrest had 31 complaints over 19 months, and every one of them, filed through the department's online portal, sent by letter, routed through the regional office in Barrie, had ended at Victor Rain's name. Not because he'd been found responsible, because every complaint had arrived on his desk as part of standard regional routing, and Victor had a way of making problems stop producing paperwork without quite resolving them. The analyst who flagged the cluster to Frederick had written one word in the margin of the summary sheet: pattern. Victor made his circuit of the floor and then crossed the waiting area with his hands in his pockets, reading the room the way a man reads, a room he has already decided he understands. He stopped 3 feet from chair 14. "Morning," he said. "You need some help finding something?" Frederick looked up from the legal pad and said he was waiting for his number. Victor looked at the number slip in Frederick's hand. 47. That's a bit of a wait. He said it like he was doing Frederick a favor by observing it. "What's the nature of your inquiry, if you don't mind my asking? Might be something we can sort out faster." Frederick said he was there to review some records regarding a processing timeline inquiry, and that he was content to wait his turn. Something in Victor's posture shifted, not dramatically, the small recalibration of a man who has categorized the person in front of him and finds the category doesn't quite hold. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at the coffee mug, a reusable one from a hardware store, faded, logo peeling. He looked at the worn parka and the boots that had been resoled once. "Processing timeline inquiry," Victor repeated. "That's right." Victor said the walk-in queue was running long today, and that for records inquiries, the online booking system would get him a dedicated appointment with the appropriate staff. He said the online system was generally faster and more efficient for that type of request. He said all of this pleasantly, in the voice of a man explaining a bus schedule to a tourist. Frederick said he had reviewed the department's service standard, and that walk-in service for inquiries was available during posted hours. He said he had been waiting since 9:02 and was content to wait as long as necessary. Victor smiled the way a man smiles when he is deciding something. "The thing is," he said, "we have a full house today, and for the nature of what you're describing," he paused, "it might be better handled through a formal channel." Frederick said he was using the formal channel. He said window service during posted hours was the department's stated formal channel for walk-in requests. In the chairs around them, 3 other people had gone still in the specific way of people who are pretending they cannot hear something 2 feet away. Victor straightened. He glanced toward the entrance, and then toward the service windows, and what passed across his face in that moment was not anger. It was a calculation about inconvenience, and it arrived at a number he found unacceptable. He turned toward the door that led to the back of the office and said something quiet to a man standing near it, a security contractor named Kyle, whose lanyard identified him as belonging to a firm that serviced 3 other government buildings in the area. Kyle was 26 and did not look happy about what he'd been asked to do, but he crossed the waiting area and told Frederick politely that he would need to accompany him to the front entrance. Frederick stood without being told twice. He picked up the legal pad and the coffee mug. He put his number slip, 47, back into his jacket pocket, which was a small decision he had not consciously planned but which would matter later. He walked to the door without turning around, and the bell above it rang when it opened, and rang again when it closed behind him. It was -8 degrees in the parking lot. The sky over Pinecrest was the white of a sky that cannot decide whether to snow. Frederick stood on the concrete apron outside the entrance and counted 15 people in the waiting area. 1 young woman at window 2 who had looked up when Frederick stood and then looked back at her terminal. 1 man in the back row of chairs who watched the entire walk to the door and then took out his phone and then put it back in his coat. Kyle stood on the other side of the glass for a moment, not quite making eye contact through it, and then turned and went back to his post. Frederick put both hands in his pockets and stood there in the cold. At 10 exactly, his phone rang against his ribs. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. It rang again 40 seconds later. Then a 3rd time. Nobody came out of the office to ask about it. Victor was already behind the service floor, and Kyle was back at his post, and the 15 people in the plastic chairs had made the silent collective decision that a stranger's cold morning in a parking lot was cheaper than whatever it would cost them to say something about it. The support detail 32 kilometers south had listened to 3 calls go to voicemail, had watched a location ping that hadn't moved from a parking lot in 14 minutes, and had stopped waiting. They were in their vehicles in 90 seconds. The 2 dark government vehicles came off Ridgemont Road at 10:23 and pulled into the lot in a way that closed most of it without blocking the exit. 4 people got out of the first vehicle and 2 from the second. Federal identification on lanyards. Parkas with Service Canada's federal crest on the left chest. The woman who came around the front of the lead vehicle moved the way people move when they are scanning for one specific thing, one pass of the lot, and then her eyes stopped. She walked directly toward the entrance. Christine Wolfe was 44 years old and had been deputy to 3 inspector generals before Frederick, and what she was looking at in this parking lot, a man in a worn parka standing alone in -8 degrees with his hands in his pockets, made something go tight in her jaw that she did not allow to show on her face. She produced her identification, said her name to Kyle, who was now holding the door. She said she was looking for Inspector General Frederick Lorne. Kyle said the name twice, said he had not known that name. Christine looked at the man in the parka. "Director," she said, "are you all right?" Frederick said he was fine and that it was cold. Behind Christine, Morris Leung came forward from the second vehicle. He was 61 and had been in federal compliance for 23 years, and he had the manner of a man who makes difficult announcements without raising his voice and is understood by everyone present regardless. He held his identification up and turned it slowly, toward the office windows, toward the parking lot, toward the entrance where Kyle was now standing with his hand still on the glass. "This is Frederick Lorne," Morris said, "Inspector General of Service Canada, appointed 15 days ago. He is here under federal authority." He paused one beat. "As of now, this office is under active audit." The sound that went through the parking lot was not a gasp. It was smaller than that and worse. It was a group of people arriving at the same fact in the same second, none of them quite able to locate the correct expression for it. Victor appeared in the doorway 12 seconds later. He had come down from the back office quickly and it showed. He was already speaking when he pushed through the door, saying there had been a misunderstanding, that a gentleman had been disruptive in the waiting area and had declined to identify himself, that he was happy to assist the federal team in any way. He stopped, because Christine was not looking at him. She was looking at the man in the parka, who was looking at Victor the way a man looks at something he has already read in a document and is now confirming in person. "Director," Christine said to Frederick, "should we proceed?" Frederick said yes. Then he said one other thing, quietly, so that Victor heard it, and Kyle heard it, and Morris heard it, and the 2 clients who had followed the noise outside heard it. He said, "I told you my inquiry was about a processing timeline. You had my number right there. You didn't ask." Victor's mouth opened and nothing useful came out of it. Christine put out her hand for the access card that would take the audit team through the building's interior door. After a moment, Victor produced it from his shirt pocket. His fingers did not work quite right. He dropped it on the concrete and had to pick it up, and nobody in the parking lot moved while he did, and there was no sound anywhere except the idling of the government vehicles. The audit team went in. Frederick stayed in the lot until Morris had names of everyone present written down. Then he went inside. Andrew Fisk at window 2 had not stopped working since the vehicles arrived. He was calling numbers, typing, asking each person what they needed. The only person on the service floor behaving as though the federal team were furniture. Frederick noted it the same way he had noted it at 9:02 that morning. The security cameras came down from the walls within the hour. 2 in the waiting area, 1 above the entrance, 1 in the hallway behind the service floor. They went into evidence bags with serial numbers documented. Server access was suspended at 10:51. Victor sat in his own office while 2 compliance officers photographed its contents and asked him questions he answered with increasing caution. At 11:14, he filed a supplemental incident report through the department's internal system, describing a visitor who had been uncooperative and unable to produce satisfactory identification when requested. He filed it from his own terminal, which was physically present in a room with 2 federal auditors at the time. The report was timestamped automatically. It could not be unfiled. He did not know yet that the report was the second worst decision of his morning. The worst was having asked Kyle to walk the man in the parka to the door in the first place. Morris found the first irregularity at 12:40. A file marked closed with no outcome notation. A woman named Bernadette from the east side of town who had applied for EI benefits after a layoff, whose application had been reviewed, denied without a documented reason, and whose file had been closed 14 months ago. Bernadette had never received an explanation, never received a callback. Her phone number was still in the system. It still worked. There were 11 more files like it by 3:00 in the afternoon. 3 files had processing dates altered after the initial timestamp, altered beyond the system's permitted correction window, which meant the changes appeared in the audit log as separate events. In 2 of those files, the original processing date would have triggered an automatic supervisory review. The altered dates did not. One file contained a handwritten note that had been scanned and uploaded. It read in handwriting that the office's personnel records would later match to Victor Rain's own employee documentation. Follow up WB, tell her to try the Barry office. The person referred to as B had written one of the 6 complaints that had reached Frederick's desk in Ottawa. There were 4 complaints in the department's internal system that had arrived via the correct channel, been received and logged, and then been categorized as resolved with no action record attached. The resolution date in 3 of them preceded any documented contact with the complainant. Andrew came to Morris at 2:15 with a piece of paper he had been keeping in the back of a personal notebook he brought to work every day. It was a printout of an internal process flag he had raised 8 months ago regarding a file that seemed to him to have been closed without resolution. The flag had been marked reviewed and returned to him as no issue identified. The file it referenced was one of the 11 Morris had flagged before lunch. Andrew set the paper on the table in the conference room the audit team was using and said he had not been sure whether to bring it, and that he had carried it for 8 months, and that he was sorry it had taken this long. Morris took the paper and told him he was the first person in the building to bring anything forward voluntarily, that it would be noted. Beverly Tapp, who had worked the reception desk for 11 years and had greeted every person who ever walked through that door, including Frederick at 9:02 that morning, gave a statement that ran 3 hours and 20 minutes. She cried twice. She said she had been telling herself for 11 years that she was not responsible for things she had no power to change, and that she had believed it right up until the moment Victor asked Kyle to walk a man with a legal pad out into -8. People started coming in that afternoon and into the next 2 days. By the end of the first week, Frederick's team had 22 statements on file. 14 of them described experiences more than 2 years old, which meant those people had been carrying those mornings alone, each one believing they were the only person it had happened to. Victor was suspended with pay pending investigation. The regional compliance director in Barrie, who had been receiving flagged complaints and routing them back to Pinecrest for response, was placed under separate review. Her supervisor had been aware of 2 routed complaints and had not escalated. That became a 3rd file. Christine came to the room they'd given Frederick in the town hall late that first evening, set a paper cup of coffee on the table, and said the thing that had been sitting with her since she found him in that parking lot at 10:23. She said he could have ended it in 3 seconds. She said she had watched the lobby camera footage twice, and there were at least 2 moments before Kyle ever crossed the floor where one sentence would have stopped the whole thing cold. She said she needed to understand why he hadn't said it. Frederick turned the cup once on the table without picking it up. He said that when he took the job, 6 complaints from this particular county had crossed his desk in the same week, all describing the same morning in almost identical language. He said he had read them in a conference room in Ottawa where everybody agreed the situation was concerning, and nobody present had ever sat in that plastic chair and been told the walk-in queue was full when the policy said otherwise. I needed to know what it actually feels like, he said. To be the person a room decides is not worth the inconvenience, not to read about it, not to be briefed on it, to be the man in the cold parking lot with no title to say out loud and nobody who was coming for him. Christine said that by 10:23, he'd had 2 vehicles coming. Frederick said Bernadette didn't. That was the entire point. She sat in chair 14, or one just like it, and held her number, and nobody came for her. And the only difference between her and me this morning is that my phone was already ringing. He said if he had identified himself in the lobby, Victor would have produced a sincere apology before lunch, and the regional office in Barrie would have drafted a clean process review by the following Friday, and every one of those files would have stayed exactly where it was. He said the audit was the only evidence that couldn't be managed after the fact. He said he had let the morning happen because he was the first person in that office in 17 years who could afford to. Christine was quiet for a long time after that. Then she asked whether he intended to speak to Victor before he left. He said he did. He said he would do it in front of Victor's lawyer, with nothing in his hands and nothing to ask. And that he was going to be careful because he was both a witness and a victim in this case, and he was not going to hand any defense counsel a reason to throw a single count. It happened 2 days later, on the front steps of the Service Canada building, at 4 in the afternoon. Victor came out with his lawyer half a step behind him. He was in a fleece jacket and an untucked shirt, and without the authority of the office behind him, he looked like what he was, a heavy-set man of 60 who had run out of phone numbers. He stopped when he saw who was at the bottom of the steps. His lawyer put a hand on his arm and said something quiet. Victor shook his head and said he had things he needed to say. He said he had kept that office running for 17 years. Said there had not been a single fraud investigation under his watch. Said he had helped a woman from the South End navigate her late husband's pension claim on a Sunday evening on his personal mobile. Said half the complainants standing in that town hall queue had called him directly at some point for help with something. He said all of it flatly, like a man reading his resume to someone he already knows isn't hiring. Frederick told him every word of that was in the file and would go to the Crown prosecutor along with everything else. Then Victor said the thing he had clearly been building toward for 2 days. He said none of this would have happened if a stranger had not walked in looking for trouble. He said if the man had just gone online and booked an appointment, none of it would have come to this, and he did not finish the sentence because he heard it as he was saying it. No, Frederick said. He said that people always believe the collapse started the day someone finally caught them. It never does. He said 31 complaints had been accumulating in the department system before he ever crossed the town line, that 3 files had altered timestamps before he ever sat down in chair 14, that Bernadette's application had been closed without a reason given 8 months before he took the job in Ottawa. He said, none of that had anything to do with a walk-in queue. You didn't fall this morning because you had the wrong man walked out of your lobby, Frederick said. You'd have fallen the same way if I'd been nobody. The only difference is it would have taken longer and cost more people on the way down. He said, you stopped being able to tell the difference between running an office and running a room, and once a man can't tell those apart, the authority he holds is just a delay. Victor looked at the railing under his hand. He said very quietly that he had never thought of himself as someone who did harm. Frederick said he believed that, and said it was the reason the file was 17 years long. Frederick flew back to Ottawa on the morning of the 3rd day. The case was formally consolidated before the end of the month. He returned to Pinecrest on a Thursday 19 days after the first visit. Same car, same parka. He arrived at 9:05. The waiting area was different, more windows staffed, a posted notice on the wall explaining the interim review process for clients who believed a previous application had been improperly handled. The carpet was the same gray-green. The number dispenser was the same. The room recognized him before the door was fully open. Every head came up. Frederick stood in the entrance, and the woman sitting in chair 14 moved to chair 13 without being asked, and somebody in the back row stood to stand, and the person next to him stood, and then it happened all at once. Nobody said his title. Nobody said a word. They stood the way people stand when they are doing the only thing left to them that means something. Andrew was at window 2. When he saw Frederick, he set down what he was holding and stood with everyone else, which meant every service window in the office was empty for those 30 seconds, and nobody in the waiting area seemed to mind. Frederick looked at the room and nodded once. Then he sat down in chair 14 and took number 52 from the dispenser. Beverly came around the reception counter with a paper cup of coffee, the office kind, thin walls that burn your hand if you're not paying attention, and set it on the chair arm beside him. She said she had not slept well the first week of the audit. She said she had sat in her car in this parking lot at 6:30 on the morning after and not been able to go in. She said she had gone in anyway and was still trying to decide whether that made her brave or just punctual. Frederick told her the statement she had given was in the case file and was the most complete account of the office's intake practices over a decade that the team had found anywhere in the building. She went back behind the counter without saying anything else, and for a while neither did anyone. The preliminary findings were released publicly 9 weeks later. 11 applications improperly closed without documented reason, 3 files with altered processing dates, 4 complaints marked resolved with no supporting action record, a systemic pattern of discretionary intake decisions that had no policy basis and had fallen disproportionately on clients presenting without appointment or who had previously filed a complaint. Victor Raines was charged under Section 122 of the Criminal Code with breach of trust by a public officer, and separately under the Financial Administration Act with willful misuse of departmental records. His trial lasted 4 days. He was convicted on the primary count and received a conditional sentence of 16 months with mandatory community service and permanent disqualification from federal public employment. He forfeited his pension. The regional compliance director in Barrie accepted early retirement under a negotiated agreement that required her full cooperation. Her supervisor took a leave of absence that became permanent. Andrew Fisk was offered a position with the regional compliance team in the fall. He took it. He said publicly, when asked, that he had done the minimum, written 1 process flag, kept 1 printout, waited 8 months to hand it over, and that a man should not be promoted for doing the minimum. Morris Long, who was present when Andrew said it, told him that across 17 years in that office, he had been the only person who had kept a light on, that sometimes the minimum is what gets through. The reforms were not complicated. File closure required a documented reason and a client notification within 14 days. Complaints could no longer be routed for response to the office named in the complaint. Walk-in requests had to be logged at arrival, not at the window, which meant the record existed before any staff discretion was applied. Every intake interaction was subject to quarterly review by a team outside the regional structure. None of it was new policy. All of it was existing policy that had simply never been enforced in Pinecrest, because the person responsible for enforcing it had been the person benefiting from its absence. Bernadette received a callback. Her EI claim was reassessed and approved retroactively, with back payments covering 16 months. When the check arrived, she sat with it at her kitchen table for a long time before she deposited it, because 16 months had been a very specific kind of hard, and a check makes it official in a way that does not always feel like relief right away. She was one of 9 clients who received retroactive resolutions in the first review cycle. By the end of the second, there were 23. What actually changed in Pinecrest was harder to put in a file. People started talking the way people talk when they discover that the story they thought had happened only to them has a list. The interim review queue ran 11 days. By the end of it, Frederick's team had 47 statements. 31 of them described incidents more than 3 years old. Each one of those people had held a number in a plastic chair and believed that the morning they were having was private and unrepeatable, and theirs alone to carry home. It almost never is. The town did not celebrate when Victor Raines was convicted. There was no crowd outside the courthouse. By the afternoon of the sentencing, the lot outside the Pinecrest Service Canada office was ordinary. A few cars, a minivan with a car seat in the back window, somebody's bicycle locked to the accessible ramp railing. The office was open. The service windows were staffed. Andrew was at window 2, calling numbers clearly, asking each person what they needed, typing quickly. Everything about the room was the same as it had been, except that it was not. Because Victor Raines did not fall, because he had the wrong man walked out his door. He fell because of the 17 years before that morning, and because the record was always going to say exactly what it said, and because the only thing that had been missing was someone who could afford to be the man in the plastic chair, to sit there with no title to say out loud, and no one coming for him, and let the morning write itself down. The difference between Frederick Lorne and Bernadette and the 11 others whose files had been quietly closed was not courage or integrity or knowing the right words to say. It was a phone that rang. Power does not reveal a man. How he treats the people who appear to have none does. The stranger with no appointment, the woman who doesn't know the process, the man who has already been told once to go to the Barry office. Victor Raines made his choice on a Tuesday morning in a lobby where 15 people decided a stranger's cold parking lot was not their problem, and the record wrote itself carefully around every single one of them. It had been writing for 17 years. It only needed one morning when someone could afford to stay in the chair long enough to let it finish.